Hey, everybody, this is Joe Turner with the City Manager Unfiltered podcast. And before we jump into this third and final installment with Michael Penny, the chairman of the ICMA's Credentialing Advisory Board, I wanted to give you a look ahead at the upcoming episodes I'm going to drop in successive weeks. Next week, I'm going to drop an episode with Amy Farkas, the Patton Township manager in Pennsylvania. We're going to talk about what I consider to be her rather unusual way to let off some steam and to bring some work-life balance to her life and to cope with the stresses of the job. And we're also going to talk about the glass ceiling and bringing more women and minorities into the profession and how we can accomplish that. So stay tuned for that episode next week. Following her interview, I'm going to drop a two-part series with Sam Tolles. He is a social media expert. He used to work in Hollywood, the entertainment industry. He's got a pretty fascinating background. He believes that most cities in the country are doing social media wrong, and we're going to talk about how you can do social media right. And stay tuned for that. I think that's going to be a really interesting episode because over the last 2 years, I've gotten quite a bit of feedback on the desire to talk about social media. I personally think social media is an absolute sewer, and I think elected officials have way too many knee-jerk reactions to a couple of loudmouths on the platforms. So we're going to get into that again in the two-part series. And then after those interviews, I'm going to drop a really intense interview with Audrey Guzman. She is the Soldier Township Administrator in Kansas, and she's gone through a pretty hellacious childhood, a tough adulthood, and we're also going to talk about her crazy first manager experience through the pandemic and a natural gas crisis that hit Kansas a couple of years ago. It was pretty phenomenal. So for those cities out there that have their own natural gas utility, it was a crazy, wild ride for a lot of these managers. So that's a look ahead at the next, several weeks of episodes. And now that we're going to jump into a third installment of the Michael Penny series, I wanted to take a moment to invite you all listening, if you've enjoyed this series and you want to ask a question about the Credentialed Manager program, I'm exploring the idea with Michael of doing a live Q&A, a live webinar. So if you're interested in a live Q&A on the Credentialed Manager program, I need to get some positive feedback from you, the listener. Are you willing to ask a question in public of Michael about the program? Because if nobody wants to ask a question, it's not really going to be that exciting. I mean, I guess I can read questions if you want to submit them to me, but I'm looking for people who want to actually ask a question so we can do a Q&A. I think that would be a pretty interesting format and something I've been wanting to try for a while. So again, if you have some questions about the Credentialed Manager program and you want to get some answers from the expert, from the man who's running point when it comes to the ICMA, this is your opportunity. So please give me some feedback, either through email, text, LinkedIn message, what have you, okay? If you want to reach me on email, you can reach me at citymanagerunfiltered@gmail.com. You can also reach me via text on my cell phone at 316-880-9886. That's 316-880-9886. All right? So stand up and be counted. Be a part of this experience. I need questions if we're going to do a live Q&A. On that note, let's jump to this third and final installment. I think you're going to enjoy it. Michael Penny, Castle Pines, Colorado City Manager. He is the chairman of the ICMA's Credentialing Advisory Board, and I think you're going to enjoy this installment because, again, we have some differences of opinion, but we also agree on many aspects. So here you go. All right. I'm Joe Turner, and this is the City Manager Unfiltered podcast, a podcast for city managers and other public sector executives. This is part 3 of my interview series with Michael Penny, Castle Pines, Colorado City Manager. Michael, I've never done a 3-part interview series, not even with actually, no, I did. I did with Daniel Rosemont. I got a 3-part series out of him. He had to write a book to get a 3-part series to show up. So welcome to the program for the third installment on our conversation about ICMA credentials and other things. So welcome to the show.
Thank you, Joe. It's an honor to be here, and I've appreciated our multi-hour conversation now broken up into what sounds like it'll be 3 segments. So I appreciate it and honored to be a guest.
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit before we got on the recording here, but I do think it's important that the audience see me invite other people on who have different viewpoints and oppositional viewpoints, and that you can have a conversation and disagree in polite fashion and still have respect for one another. I have no problem with people sharing a pro ICMA viewpoint or things of that sort of nature. So I like to have robust conversations that are interesting and informative. And hey, if we disagree, I think the audience gets value out of that. They get to hear two different perspectives.
Absolutely. And I think, most of what we talked about or have and will talk about, at the end of the day, there's no right or wrong answer. It's the collective of the we that figures out what the best direction, whether it's AAME, whether it's ICMA, whether it's the credentialing program. I truly believe everybody has that best of intent and is working to move things in the direction that we want. And it's only through the conversation that things start to solidify or move. As you've challenged us as ICMA members, ICMA isn't going to change unless we voice our concerns. And as I said in the last episode, the credentialing advisory program has changed substantively over the years from feedback from potential credentialed managers and existing credentialed managers who, for example, wanted a more streamlined annual report process. And so we created a holistic report, and that information, as I said earlier, is online. So, but I think this is it. And you mentioned that some of our conversation in the last one helped crystallize the direction for AAME. And so I do think it doesn't come from us surrounding ourselves from groupthink mentality. It comes from having the respect. I've got incredible respect for you. You've demonstrated respect for me. And if we were in the same town, once we're done with this interview, if this is the last episode, we'd go grab a beer, right?
That's right.
And
Yeah.
and it's not about our disagreements. It's about our collective desire to have our both profession and our professionals the best that they can be, and all the things that that means.
Amen, brother. Amen. So we're going to turn our conversation now more to the credential and the process of recruitment and how that all plays in. And I'm sure we'll riff on the recruitment process in general here. But we touched on this in the last episode and the first episode too, as well. Is this sort of competing perspectives or perceptions on the credential and whether or not it's a measure of competency. And I think that is really the crux of the issue right now for a lot of folks, is that you have people on my side of the aisle, so to speak, and I hate to use that, maybe it's not the right
Mm-hmm.
terminology, but you have people on my side of the aisle who are arguing that the credential is being weaponized against city managers because the credential has this perception of being a measure of competency. Like if you are an ICMA credentialed manager, you are theoretically the Ivy League of city managers. I think that's what a lot of people have that perception of. I think a lot of governing bodies have that perception. And therefore, I think that's creating maybe some of the friction, because if the conversation was really about, hey, this is just a tool for self-assessment and making us better managers, I don't think many of us would have as much heartburn. But when it's being perceived by many of us as a measure of competency, and then it's also then being injected into job descriptions or job ads for being a preferred or desirable qualification in order to get hired, I think you can understand some of that tension there.
Absolutely. And I think, kind of on the heels of the last episode, I'd be really curious for your listeners to provide feedback either to the credentialing at icma.org website email address, or to you directly. And then you and I can follow up on that, on how much of this is perception versus reality. Like, are there more than the one-off examples of where somebody has not been, or feels like they have not been able to apply for the job over, oh, it says you got to have an MPA. Well, I only have a bachelor's degree, right? So I can't apply for that job. Again, it's not, I would strongly disagree that it's not a weaponized tool. I from the information I have, I wish it was more of an issue than I think it truly is, based upon the information that I have. Because as we said at the end of the last episode, I am working hard. I believe the Credentialing Advisory Board is working hard to get it out there, because if anything, I think we feel like it's not acknowledged and known about from recruiters, and certainly from elected officials, as we ended the last one, how many elected officials know what ICMA is unless the
Right.
manager tells them? Same for the credentialing program. And so maybe we're at odds in terms of where we're trying to get to. But I would argue that it's much more of a perception than it is a reality at this point. And I wish it was a reality, because maybe we would do something differently if we were truly seeing that as an impediment for people to get promoted into manager jobs.
Well, we're riffing on the fly here, right? Like this isn't like a planned interview. We don't script it out. We're feeding off of each other. And
Absolutely not.
what's interesting to me is you bring up this point about the governing body, many of them not knowing even what the ICMA is or the ICMA credential is, for that matter, right? And I have two divergent kind of points on that. One is, okay, I can agree with that. And I will also further, if I'm being intellectually honest with you, Michael, which I always want to be, is I would say that the evidence I have that it's being weaponized, or the evidence that I have that it's being used to sort of as a determining factor when it comes to hiring managers, and this perception of competency versus self assessment or what have you, that is anecdotal. I don't have any hardcore numbers to give you. I'm not going to BS you. I would never do that. I would posit this though: if you're labeling something as being a credential or credentialed manager, I don't think that the governing body members or elected officials are automatically thinking, "Oh, this is a self-assessment tool or a way for individuals to self-assess." To me, it's inherently going to be a default position of, "Oh, this must be a measure of competency," and that's where I think that's, even though I can concede that it's anecdotal, I think you could also concede the fact that that's going to be logically a human perception would be to perceive that as a competency-based metric as opposed to a qualitative-based metric, or what have you.
I'd be hard pressed to argue that. I, I think in the totality of the hiring process, and maybe this is a segue into talking about that, I would venture to say that maybe at worst, it's a checkbox in a recruiter, or if it was done internally from an HR, as if they put it in there as a preferred, but that at the end of the day, you and I, or the other dozen or 2 dozen people who are applying for the job, when we fill out our questionnaire for the recruiter or the HR, in general, probably going to answer fairly consistently, right? And we're going to have an undergrad in something, and we're going to have a master's in something else that meets that criteria. And maybe I've got some military background, and maybe I've got some private sector background. Whatever it is that brings us into that place, the recruiter, I'm going to pick on the recruiting process, they're going to have their own filtering criteria that, again, I would say is much more substantively impactful on weeding people out than the perception of whether the credentialed manager, not arguing your
Oh,
point
yes, I'm
against,
with you. Yep.
but really from an impactful ability of me to get X job, that recruiter has much more, whatever their built-in biases are in, and right there. So they probably went out and talked to the council. They probably talked to the community. They talked to the staff. You have to get through their gauntlet of whatever that process
Absolutely.
is. And
Absolutely.
then truly at the end of the day, I've been hired in 4 different places and had numerous elected bodies over the 20 plus years, 20 X years that I've been a manager. Obviously not hiring, but I am a firm believer, and just in my experience, that at the end of the day, they're sitting across from you and they're making that decision not on your paperwork, but it's about fit. And
Absolutely.
does the person scare me? Are they going to do what I want? Or do they make me laugh? Are they gonna if they're an introvert, is this manager going to help me bring my policies forward?
Right.
Whatever their human attributes are as an elected official, they're looking and seeing, does this person help further my goals as an elected person or not?
100%.
Not how did they fill out question 3 of 27, right? On a, I'd argue that, I mean, we hope that our councils read our packets, right? Are they
Of
really
course.
going to read hundreds of pages of responses from recruiters, or watch 10 or 20 videos that might be 30 minutes in length of self
Yeah. Yeah,
Self-recording.
exactly.
I don't know what the
Yeah.
terminology is, right? So at the end of the day, and that's why I think it's a good shift to the recruitment and the hiring process, is the built-in biases of the dynamics of the council, of the recruiter, or even of the HR director. I have applied at a place where it was done internally, and the details aren't overly important, other than I am confident that HR director on their own chose to exclude me from being a viable candidate in front of the body. And
Right.
that's what's going to get truly in the way. And again, if others feel differently, I'm totally open to understanding and having that conversation. But I think there's a whole conversation around the hiring process. And that goes to what we've said in part one and part two about how do we, again, the collective we, do the best job of educating and informing the elected body for that periodic moment when they're hiring about the value of the council manager form of government. And then tied to that, the quality of the professional that is going to fill that slot, and understanding that they really should be looking for what needs does the organization and the community have, and who best can help them carry that out, in addition to who would be fun to work with. And I use fun in kind of quotes in
Yeah,
the
yeah, I know.
totality
Yeah, yeah.
of the
You're being
interaction.
funny with the fun. That's all.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Yes,
No,
exactly.
but I want to circle back to something real quick, and I want to extend an olive branch that I think that has some merit. Okay, so let's talk about the context of the ICMA credential in these job ads and what have you, right?
Hmm.
In council education, I would posit to you that it would make sense for the ICMA to do a better job of educating, and this is to advance the ICMA not only from a reputational standpoint, but from their standpoint, but also the credential itself, right? To do a better job of proactively communicating with the governing bodies about the credential and what it does. And I would also go one step further and say, how about this? How about we start looking at job ad language, right? And change it to, instead of having the ICMA credential as a preferred qualification or desired qualification in the qualification box, how about we move it to the conversation about where we talk about wanting managers who are engaging in continuous education and professional development, and maybe start referring to the ICMA credential in the context of, we're looking for city managers who are constantly looking to better themselves, to engage in personal, professional development, and utilize tools like the ICMA credential process, as opposed to making that a qualification requirement that appears to be based off competency. Does that make sense where I'm saying as far as that?
It does. And I think that challenge in kind of the totality of what we're talking about, so yes, it makes full sense, is there's a need to work with the recruiters across the nation, not just in this arena, right? But in the totality of what the job description is, and how are they filtering the applicants prior to, how are they determining, in whatever that means, who gets in front of the city council,
Right.
and are they truly being fair and equitable around what that is, and being fair to the applicants, saying, Joe, you're a very conservative manager, this is a very liberal council, you got a slim chance on God's green earth to get hired.
Yeah. What are you
So
thinking? No, just kidding.
yeah, so probably don't want to waste your time, right? and
Probably not
and
doing a very good self-assessment on that ICMA credential either.
exactly. And and not to generalize on recruiters, because I think some do a really good job, and I know you're critical of one in particular,
The
but I
one that we
also,
won't name? No, I'm just kidding.
you can name them. I'll let you do the naming. But I also think that there's a lot out there that, and at the end of the day, it's not even the letterhead, right? It's the individual that gets assigned to that particular recruitment. And are they more of a rinse and repeat, or are they
That's a great
truly,
point. That's a great point, because the
right?
recruiters within the recruitment firm have different styles and
Oh,
and performance levels.
100%.
Absolutely.
You're
Yeah.
right. It's, and I think that, as a tangent, that's kind of one of my quotes with consultants is, you might have a great consulting letterhead, but you can get a really crappy consultant assigned to you, right?
Right. Absolutely.
Versus, hey, I've heard great things about that particular company, that letterhead. As we've talked around this over the last 3+ hours, the awareness and understanding of our elected body and knowing that they constantly turn and churn, how do we handle that? And then with the recruitments, how are we holding them accountable as the applicant? Because right in the private sector, and I'm speaking a little out of turn because I don't know, but my understanding is there's a lot more. I might, as if I'm representing you, I'm going to get, I don't know what it is, 10% of your first year's contract is my payment, and if it's not you, I don't get anything. And I might put three members forward who I think are really, as CEO of whatever organization, hoping that the board of directors is going to pick one of those three. You're representing these other ones, and you're advocating on behalf of those three, saying we think that this will be great, right? Our model and again, maybe I'm not 100% accurate on that analogy of what happens in the private sector, but certainly in the public sector, they get hired from $15,000 to, I think your last example was $136,000
For Dallas, right?
for Dallas, and they're
Yes.
running a recruitment firm. And again, I'm not being 100% fair and I'm generalizing here, but their hope is that they'll find somebody who will last whatever the contractual agreement is, probably 2 years, or else they got to come back at 50% to go find another one, right? And not that that's a diss on recruitments, but they aren't. And it goes to your goal around AAME, which is they, on a lot of cases, are not representing me. They're trying to pick a pool that the body will find somebody that they're happy with.
Yes. True.
And
Yeah.
and that's I don't mean to imply it's a low bar like that, but
No, no, no.
obviously their hope is that it's going
They're
to be a
getting paid
long
to fill the
term.
seat, right? I mean, they want to.
Yeah. Yeah. And the side goal is that, the longer they last, the better they're going to get a reputation of finding good matches. But I think there's a whole component around how that business model has been created. And it hasn't been, in my opinion, there hasn't been a lot of input or feedback from the managers,
Absolutely
whether
none.
they're hired or the applicants, to say, that ain't working for us.
Right. Zero feedback.
Yeah, I get hired and I'm all ecstatic and I like the guy for a day because he facilitated me getting the job. And if I don't get hired, I'm pissed or I'm not pissed and I move on, whatever. So that's another area of how do we as the most impacted party influence that? And then a component of that, to go back to your original statement, is, evaluation of where the ICMA credentialing program plays into that process. But again, I would argue wholeheartedly that that is a minuscule impact in the totality of the biases and the approach that
I agree.
recruiters have.
I agree 100% on that. And so I want to move on, but just this one, I want to make sure we got this clarification down because
Yeah,
you're a member of the AAME and I'm talking to a member. So I want to make sure we're on the same page here. It sounds to me, even though we have some disagreements on whether or not we think it's being weaponized or abused or whatnot, we do have some agreement that there is a perception divergence between the members of the ICMA as well as the governing body elected officials, right? We agree there's a perception divergence there as far as on the whole competency versus self-evaluation tool. Is that fair to say?
I think
Okay.
yeah,
Okay.
yes.
And would you also then say, Joe, I do think it's fair for you to articulate and make the case for tweaking the language that we're having, basically for AAME to go out and encourage these recruiters to tweak the language that they're currently using when it comes to the credential and how they're describing it to elected officials, to turn it into more of a to put it in the part of the job description announcement that has to do with self-development and being proactive with continuous education and so forth and so on, as opposed to a qualification that's imparting or imputing this notion of competency. That's fair?
I think it's fair, but I also think the challenge should be given to the credentialing advisory board to analyze that dichotomy and say what level of competency does come from being a credentialed manager. And the only thing that really comes to mind on the 0 to 3 response on that is in theory, when you've got 7 years of experience, and not that a non-credentialed manager with 15 years of experience wouldn't, in theory, on my argument, have more competency than the 7-year credentialed manager. So I get your point, but I guess my point is, yes, that's fair, but I also think it's a good challenge for the credentialing advisory board, because we're not sitting back on our laurels saying that, we've got the greatest program and it's sealed in time. As I've said numerous times, we are constantly looking at how do we improve this. And I think it's fair also in the sense that competency in a local government manager is, and maybe this is too strong a term, is a misnomer, right? And that goes to what we've said and kind of walked around in all of our conversation, which is a good manager in one community could be fired in 2 days from the other one. And
Right.
so
True.
the word competency as a manager is, how do you define competency in the manager? You might, if you're a municipality that has a high need for economic development and you've got a high growth rate in commercial development, but the way that that's happening is public-private partnerships with, whether it's sales tax credits or, whatever it may be, competency in that case might have come from somebody who's able to demonstrate or articulate that they've had a lot of experience, maybe they were ED director for a while, right? Or whatever that may be. But competence, maybe they're, from a competency standpoint, they're a really crappy leader, right?
Right.
And so I think that comes back, if we go full circle back to why the credentialing program is a voluntary program. And it is, to your point, much more internally and self-focused around wanting to be the best that you can be, and helping you, in theory, do that, because you can't test for competency in, or at least I would argue, you can't test for competency in a manager for many of the reasons and numerous more that I just spoke of.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So I'm glad we kind of got some common ground on that,
Yeah.
and we can kind of transition, because I do think that the recruiters have far more impact on the whole process and whether or not you're going to get the job, as opposed to the credential, whether or not it's listed in the job announcement. So let's talk a little bit more about recruitment, and we can riff on that a little bit. You know, you alluded to it a moment ago, that there really isn't a mechanism in place to have managers be able to articulate their concerns or frustrations about the recruitment process. And I've talked about that almost since day one of posting on LinkedIn. And I do have a vision for AAME to have a role in, just like we're advocating for the city manager when it comes to with their elected officials, to also maybe work with communicating to the recruiters some of the things that we need to see changed in order to provide better customer service, better treatment, and more respect, and just recognition of the needs and wants and plights of the city manager. Because, man, sometimes it boggles my mind that we have so many city managers who are working as recruiters, and then they become recruiters, and it's almost like they forget they were city managers, and they don't treat city managers like they need to be treated. I don't know. It drives me crazy.
Yeah, I would not disagree on that. I think, that if you think about the dynamics and variables of the recruiting process, you've got an elected body that, again, I would, generalizing, in a lot of cases, the manager was already there. Maybe you've got one or two seasoned manager or seasoned council members that might have been there when that manager was hired. And you've got that body of 3, 5, 7, 9, whatever the number of elected officials are, and the manager leaves. Let's assume it's on good terms, but that body has never gone through that group dynamic of hiring. And so then so there's one variable and substantially impactful. Then they have to make a decision. Do we hire a recruiter, or do we use our HR director, or through the deputy city manager, whatever that internal process is. So then you have the biases, and I don't say biases in a derogatory sense, but just those natural human biases
Of
that
course.
we're either aware of or unaware of. And you've got that built into either one of those processes. So within those two major variables, what role does AAME, or could AAME play in educating those groups on the level and role of the professional, excuse me, and to the extent that, maintaining the council manager form of government is there, but just making sure that there's a full awareness and a reality check with the recruiters. Because, I mean, I applied for I think it was a deputy once, and the recruiter wanted me to fill out 27 questions. I was like, I'm not filling out 27 questions. That it's for part one, right? You want me to answer for,
I
you can
need
look
to,
at my
I
resume.
need to take a personal day off just to complete this
Yeah,
application.
it's just, and yeah, it's one way to weed it out, but you're also, when you go to shrinking the pool, you're going to weed out potentially a lot of people because and I think you've interviewed somebody on this. I mean, that's a valuable amount of my time.
Yeah.
And if you want to be respectful, so how does that process continue to evolve? And whether that could again be the HR director or it could be the recruiter. I'd say we have less ability to influence all the HR directors, but there are a limited number of recruiters around the nation. And so potentially a role for AAME to get out there and have those conversations and get their feedback. Part of what we did in our reach out to some of the recruiters on the credentialing advisory is say, what are you looking for in there? And what is the feedback that you've gotten? And I don't want to pull us back to the credential program, but if AAME could play that same role, I'm just talking out loud here again, but host a virtual forum of recruiters, if that were possible, or individually to say, what's your process and how do we maximize the opportunity for finding the right people in quotes.
No, I think there's a lot of fertile ground here for Tillin by the AAME when it comes to helping bridge some of the disconnect between the city management community, city manager candidate pool, and the recruiters and how they're working together. I definitely think that. In fact, I've even tried doing that a little bit here with the podcast, although it's not the most ideal platform or mechanism by having a recruiter on to talk about their process. And I want to do that
That's
some more
right.
with
Yeah.
some of the other recruiters as well. But you hit the nail on the head as far as having some of that dialogue where the AAME can basically be an intermediary between the city management community and them to give them some feedback. There's a little bit of an irony here or contradiction, right? Because on one hand, you talk about that 27 question once first step process, and the flip side is we're told time and time again that the ideal candidates are those who are basically passively looking for jobs, right? They're happy in their current position, they're successful, that maybe they want to jump. Well, those candidates don't necessarily want to go through a lot of hoops, right? Because they're happy, they're not really looking for, they don't need the
Hmm.
job, right? So there's obviously a disconnect there as well. I do think that what I would like to see AAME's role as we evolve and grow and obviously get more resources and larger membership and what have you, I would like to see us take on a more assertive role in terms of educating local elected officials about the damage that turnover does in the
Hmm.
organization and how important it is to take the time, not just waste time and stall it out and be procrastinating, but use the time wisely to develop a very strong process on which you're going to actually hire someone on and bring them on board to be the city manager. Because we want these to be long, successful relationships. AAME wants to minimize the volatility and the turnover that we're seeing in the profession because none of that's good for anybody. Nobody's
Correct.
benefiting. Everyone's
Agreed.
hurting. Taxpayers are hurting because of severance packages. The organization's hurting because all the turnover causes staff to be in states of stress and there's lack of productivity and we don't know what's going on.
Agreed.
We all know what happens when a city manager loses their job and you got the spouse has to uproot their job to go someplace else. You have the kids got to pack up and go to new schools. Nobody's
Yep.
benefiting from this turnover whatsoever. So I think we need to do a better job of trying to educate these elected officials about the trauma and the impact that occurs both financially and in non-financial terms to the organization and to all the people involved when there's these turnovers. And I think we need to try to do our part to sort of lower the temperature in the room when it comes to these separations and the friction. And that's why it gets back to episode 2, I think, where we talked about AAME taking a more of a conciliatory sort of like intermediate arbitration type role to sort of almost like play marriage counselor and try to tamp some of that down. Does that make sense?
It does, and it comes to mind that we have a manager's listserv in Colorado, like probably a lot of states do, and it seems to me that one of the things that comes across periodically is, hey, my council is supposed to do a mid-year review and then an annual review, or some don't have any reviews built in. And thinking even further along the lines of what you were just saying, educating the body, and this goes to the challenge of the elected body, right? Because they may not be coalesced, they may not care, they may not have the experience, they may care but not know what to do, is helping with the development of the processes that can be used as a template for councils to pick up that say, hey, we're going to have a mid-year review.
Right.
If there's a crisis or something, here's how we're going to handle that. And here's how we're going to do the annual review. Because like everything, at the end of the day, it always comes down to communication, right? Or the
Right.
lack of communication between human beings.
100%. That's by and large every termination that you see or separation, that is almost the most important component is a communication issue.
Every divorce, every breakup, every disconnect, it's always communication, lack of, or misunderstanding, whatever that is. And so, even using my own example, my mid-year evaluation is supposed to be happening now. And like probably most managers,
It gets kicked down.
it
The
gets
kick gets
kicked.
down.
And my annual evaluation is always, I think it's moved an entire calendar year over the years, right? Because maybe I'm making this up, but it was made in January and they do it in May. Then the next year it's delayed. So it happens in July. And then pretty soon you're a whole year. And at some point you just kind of raise your hands.
And then HR and payroll loves the repeated
Oh,
retroactive, right?
yes.
Oh, we're going to retroactive
Absolutely.
3 months. Like, I'm like, come
Yeah,
on, guys. Like,
they're all ready for it because they know
yeah,
it's going to happen every year. But again, another role in thinking broader than even coming in at a close to a termination is what role could AAME play in? And this is a place where it could be through helping the manager say, hey, when you're negotiating your contract, here's some review
language or
language that we've identified, and not just that, but here's a proposed template for the process
absolutely.
using a subcommittee of the council or the city attorney or the city clerk,
This is
whatever the heck it might be.
amazing suggestion, Michael, because you're spot on, and I never really thought this far through on some of this issue. That's why I'm really enjoying this conversation. You're right. I think there is a place for AAME to basically be inserted in that process to help with the reviews or whatnot. I mean, obviously, it doesn't have to just be AAME; it could be another vehicle or entity. But I do think there's some merit to that. And you might recall in that episode when I talked, I'm pretty darn sure in that episode when I talked about the contract negotiations, I mentioned some of my personal frustrations by my inability to corral the council when it came to annual reviews and to guide that process and navigate those waters, and how I sort of like it was like whack-a-mole. Every time I thought I had them buttoned down over here, something would pop up over here. And I'm like, oh, I didn't think about that. How did I
Yeah,
let my review get out of control to where this is being included in it, or we're doing this over here? Like that was never supposed to be the plan. And I think we need to be more assertive, right? And being more deliberate in how we navigate our careers and how we set ourselves up. Like we need to be negotiating the terms of our success much more aggressively and assertively than we've been doing heretofore in this profession.
I agree completely.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what a great insight there. One of the other things, I'm not sure if you have any other common complaints or pet peeves when it comes to the recruitment process. I've talked about the piss poor communication between some recruiters and the candidates. That seems obviously go back to communication again, right? How hard is it to keep candidates in the loop on what's going on?
Yeah.
One of the things that I get some feedback on from quite a few individuals is this idea that you have a lot of recruiters, and I'm not necessarily in the recruitment firm, but the recruiters within the recruitment firm, for example, might engage in some sort of favoritism, or they have their sort of go-to squad of interim managers that they're helping place because they're friends or whatever the case might be, or there might be some implied. And this could be, by the way, not necessarily even truly happening. It could be just, the perception of the candidates who have told me these stories, right? Because we all have our biases ourselves, right? We all have our blind spots, but you have the situations where some of these recruiters are being accused of engaging in some sort of favoritism or bias when they're going through the recruitment process. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, so I've been through 3 recruitments, and then one was a direct council recruitment. So more anecdotally than anything, and so I'm going to flip on
The
our
evidence for
conversation
the
on the evidence for the credentialing, and say that it is my personal belief that happens based on nothing. Right? I don't have. I mean, I have the one example that I told you that I'm confident that the HR director just cut me arbitrarily based on their bias.
right.
But I do, when you talk about being ostracized or weaponized by the ICMA, and I'm clearly pushed back on that in my belief, but I do think, and I'm trying to actually visualize some of the meetings, but I think, and again, be totally open to feedback, that managers typically are very polite to recruiter representatives, right?
Of course.
Because they're human beings and you don't want to piss off.
You don't want to bite the hand that possibly feeds you, right?
Yeah,
I
because I
mean,
might be applying for a job that person's a recruiter, and it's really easy for them to look and go, oh, Michael Penny, oh, he was a jerk to me wherever, or I didn't like what he
or not even,
said
or not,
on
yeah,
Joe Turner's
right.
podcast, right?
Well,
And
but not even necessarily a jerk, right? Because we all know human beings naturally have some resistance to constructive feedback that they will perceive as being a negative criticism. They internalize it, right? So even if you, as a candidate, are trying to, in the benefit of the doubt, just trying to be completely like, "Hey, I just want to give you some feedback. This is concerning to me." You have that fear that it's going to be taken completely as a personal slight by that person you're communicating with, right? I mean, that's just
Yep.
reality.
And absolutely, yes. And I think that the way that the recruitment process works, where they're hired by the council and it's a cattle call through that, through those hurdles to get to that final piece. And there's, in theory at least, no one advocating for me as the applicant, right? It's me having to prove myself within the totality of the applicants that are there,
Yes.
rather than, again, I think in at least my understanding of the private sector is there is much more of an advocacy, and they're paid in a different fashion that really has them become my advocate over another recruiter who's advocating for something else. And again, I may have the facts wrong on that. So I think the system, in my kind of layman's terms, it's a very easy system. I fill out the RFP, I get hired by the firm, or by the council rather. I talk to them. What do they want? They want a transparent, long-term, executive. They want safe drinking water, safe community. I mean, we could, a little tangent, but you and I could write probably 80% of any master plan goal,
Right.
right? We all
Right.
want open space and
Well,
clean water and safe
with
streets.
well, I can tell you with Micah Gaudet's Chat GPT API course, I could probably have it right 99% for me. So.
Okay. All right. Point taken. Well
nice,
represented. I
nice plug from Micah there. His Chat GPT course.
exactly. And so again, the recruitment side of it is this generic kind of cattle call for that. And I mean, I'm not a recruiter, so again, I could be missing it. And I have talked to some recruitment firms that are coming into or looking to move into Colorado that I think are really being innovative. And I don't want to mention any names, but being innovative and thinking about how do they do a better job of representing the applicant in the totality of that process. And so I hope to see a continued evolution as opposed to, that standard bifolder recruitment document that you get has the pretty picture of some park or the city hall or the beautiful river, and then they pretty much are the cut and paste in
Yeah.
there. And obviously, everyone should take these comments with a grain of salt because you're hearing my bias in this now. But I absolutely think there is room for improvement in there. Repeating it, but hopefully not kicking the dead horse, is, it's really how well the recruitment and how educated the council is on what are they actually looking for in that manager, and the dynamics. And what you were alluding to a few moments ago, Joe, I think is when we're talking about the evaluations, it's not just the process, right? Which we don't do a good job of advocating for, but it's the dynamics of the council at that time. If you have council that's got infighting and you're trying to do your evaluation,
Yeah, it's tough.
you're going to get caught up in that in whatever fashion, because maybe somebody likes you, they don't like you, whatever.
Or they perceive you as playing favorites, or because
Uh,
you're on the
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, the
yeah.
multitude of aspects that are in there. And so that same council dynamic is so critical to understand from a recruiter or HR. And I would absolutely, while I don't have a lot of experience, that recruiter, I believe, would have an obligation to give the applicants a heads up. Hey, this council is, you're walking into a hornet's nest in here.
Well,
Not that,
that's one of the frustrations, Mike. A lot of the candidates feel like the recruiters are not always sharing that information. Now, I've had
yep,
really good experience with some recruiters. I'm gonna give a shout out to a
absolutely.
recruiter. I have a great relationship with Lynn Barbosa over at SGR. She has been amazing. I've gone through a recruitment with her, and she was very open and candid. Not only did she share with me some of the dynamics about the community that I was applying for, that she asked me to apply for, because she reached out to me actually,
Uh-huh.
which I was impressed by. Not only did she do that, she put me in touch with another manager who had experience with that community. I think two other managers, actually, if I recall correctly, who kind of gave me the lowdown and gave me the more context. And I just thought that was amazing because she wasn't hiding anything from me, right? She was saying, "Hey, these are some of the concerns. These are something you have to be aware of. This is what I've been hearing, and I'd like you to talk to this individual." And I thought that was like really stand up of her, and I thought that was phenomenal, And so I love Lynn Barbosa for that. If she's listening, shout out to her. She says she listens, so I'm going to test her on that. And
Excellent.
but some of our peers, they complain that some of these recruiters, they hide information and they don't divulge it to them
And that's the challenge of
because they
talking to
want to fill
Jen.
the seat, right? They're just trying to,
Yeah,
because well, not, let me, I'm sorry to interrupt you there, Michael,
yeah.
but there's twofold, right? Because, and in all fairness to the recruiters, they are sometimes being perceived, their value is sometimes being perceived on the size of the applicant pool, not the quality of the applicant pool. Is that a fair representation?
I think it is.
Yeah.
And the the challenge in having this conversation is generalizing to recruiters, because I think
Yes.
there's
True.
two components. There are recruiting firms that really believe in the integrity and the ethical components of the process in communicating to the applicant and really being direct with the council. Look, you guys, until you coalesce around what you want from a manager, we really shouldn't move forward with the recruitment, or whatever the example is. And then you get the unfortunate bad apples that do set, whether that's the letterhead firm or it's an individual recruiter within a particular firm. And unfortunately, I think that's a little bit of the context that we're talking about, because the vast majority of recruitments, it appears, go fairly well. I think there's room for improvement in the overall structural process by which the recruitment happens. Maybe that's a fair statement. Maybe it's
No,
not.
you're
It's
you're making a very fair statement, because I've had other managers say exactly the same thing to me, that the process in many ways is broken, and then that, and like I'm sorry to cut you off there, buddy, but the
that's
the
right.
thing the thing I'm hearing from a lot of folks is that, hell, these city council members don't even know what the hell they're looking for
Yeah,
amongst themselves.
exactly.
They don't
Yeah,
they don't, they don't even know what they want in a city manager. So how can you even have a process that even culminates in picking the right person when they don't even know what they're looking for?
and
Let
that
alone, and
goes.
sometimes they don't
Yeah.
even know what the job truly does, let alone, what I mean? It's like it's just such a multifaceted problem.
Exactly. Well, and I think we can't. And this goes to, something both I've said for years and have said to you is, there has got to be a huge, I'll say it in the positive, a huge return on the collective investment of the constant education of our elected officials, because in Colorado there are typically 2 or 4 year terms, but in between there somebody might move and you have to appoint somebody else. Some of them are in April, some are in May, some are in November, some get sworn in January, right? It's essentially every year across the 271, I think, council manager forms of government in Colorado out of the 274 or whatever it is. There is a constant churn, and I don't have a better description for it. And so you can't, oh, we trained them last year, well, better train them again this year, right? And get them,
Yeah.
and the totality of what it means to be an elected official. And we're only talking about one segment that happens. I mean, the evaluation obviously happens on a regular basis, but the hiring of a manager hopefully happens, to your earlier goal of AAME, on a much longer scale than the average of 5 or 7 years, whatever the national average is right now. And so it's that much critically important. As an example, in Colorado, the Colorado City County Management Association teamed with the Colorado Municipal League. This was many years ago, and we hired I think it was a retired manager or a former elected official, I forget now, to write. I can't remember what the white paper was called, but it was, how to hire a manager, or the value of hiring a manager. And the goal was to get in front of the council with this document prior to them engaging with a recruiter or the
Right.
HR, so that they could have some level of awareness of everything we're talking about without belaboring it. And
Yeah.
I'm guessing it isn't shared to the extent it should be. It's probably outdated by now. It's years old, and it's, all of these endeavors are only as good as we continually take on that challenge of the constant newly elected official. Because as you know, and everyone listening knows, all it takes is one body shift. You change one council member,
Absolutely.
even at seven, it changes the complete dynamics. That person can make it great for the manager, or can make it really poor for the manager. And so I truly believe that that's one of, and I don't have a solution, so I'm not proposing that I do, but I think it is such an area ripe for improving the manager's quality of life, everything that comes with that. I mean, it's huge magnitude.
Yeah, no, there isn't, and you're right, and you're spot on with that again, Michael. And Ken Decker, he had a great post, and I've talked about this too, and he riffed on it. So Ken Decker, he's also a founding member of the AAME. He put out a post recently about basically how recruiters should be behaving and acting, and what information they should be providing to the process for managers. I'm paraphrasing, I forget the exact language, but I've talked about a lot of the same points, and this idea of like, I don't understand how in 2024, for example, if I'm a recruiter, okay, even if I was just a recruiter working for a firm, unless there's a firm policy that says I can't do it, I don't know why every recruiter isn't providing the candidates who are applying for position by default the job, the contract of the existing or the most recent manager, for example, or the pay of the most recent manager. I don't know why we're not getting minimum salary requirements. I can waver a little bit on the salary range, but I would like to see a greater emphasis on like transparency when it comes to a minimum salary expectation, right? Or at least a starting range, right? Maybe don't tell us what the full range is going to be if you've been here for a while, but what's the starting range? You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And I think what are the best practices in the hiring process,
Right.
and how can AAME play a role in identifying what those are, and then encouraging all the recruiters, be, because the more feedback you get, the more you're going to be able to put those disparate comments together and say, what is a best practice? What is a baseline expectation? Every applicant should at least, I guess getting a postcard is kind of dating myself, because you get an email now, hey, thanks for applying, but you don't meet the minimum qualifications, as opposed to probably some recruiters right now, oh, I'm too busy, I'm not even going to bother. But I took the time to fill out the application. How about you give me the level of respect of at least emailing me? I guess not a postcard. But everything we're talking about is just emphasizing why there's an opportunity. I can't remember who you interviewed, but I thought that was a recruiter. But the
Michael
ones that are
Bays and
Mike, yeah,
with Clear Career. Yeah.
yep. So whether it's on the podcast or through whatever means in communicating with you and others, those that are just outstanding in their own minds, I don't know how better to describe it. We've been talking a long time. You would hope that they are willing to share that and tout their successes, because in part, if whether they're on the podcast or they're part of a conversation and get mentioned elsewhere, that name then gets out there. And whether it's a manager, an HR director, or somebody from a council through their municipal league or wherever, because a lot of them turn to the municipal league and go, hey, who should we hire to help us with the recruitment, or what do we do for the recruitment? Because that's the agencies that typically are around it. So you would hope that they'd be interested in touting their success and their values, because they're going to get more business from that. Not that others are going to steal it, because they could probably do that anyway if they wanted to. And anyway, the point of that is, their opportunity for really helping create the best one possible. If
Agreed.
if we go real broad about the profession, and you think about historical manager process, we've got and you and I chatted about this on our initial call. We've got a higher ed system across this nation that makes money off of turning out MPAs. We could have a whole conversation probably on higher ed, but in general, I mean, if you think about the historical process, is you got your undergrad in something, you started working your way up through local government. At some point, you go and you would get your MPA, maybe your MBA, more likely your MPA, and through that structure, MPA programs popped up across the nation. And there are some really good ones connected with with municipalities and have, really, I think, help move the profession forward. And then there's probably others that are, more focused on just kicking out the MPAs and aren't as tied to the actual position and connecting with local governments or elected officials or whatever. And then you've got recruiters that in the historical piece that say an MPA is required or preferred. And then, because of the churn of managers, and you've got veterans coming into the world, as we talked earlier, you've got CEOs or whatever coming in from the private sector. You have probably councils where they haven't been able to keep managers because they're in rural communities, throwing up their hands and just going, hey, let's hire the guy who lives here because we
Right.
know he's not going to move away. And as it becomes more, and you've talked about this on your podcast, as it becomes more challenging to be a manager in the political world of the political council and the kind of the whims of the council and I'm putting my family at risk because I have to live in the community and my house is upside down, but they just fired me or I had to quit, whatever it is, so all of that is really in service of what is the future of the profession and what can be done to maintain the integrity and the value of the professional manager in whatever that ultimately means. I don't want to make a judgment call about whether a veteran or a CEO of a private industry or having an MPA or not having an MPA, but how do we not have the profession turn into, and I can't remember the exact term used in one of the podcasts, but somebody claiming, we're a dime a dozen or whatever that
Right.
is. Anybody
Or it's so
can
easy a
be,
caveman can do it, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
whatever that story is. How do we tamper that down and say that's not accurate? Yes, can anybody sit in a manager's seat? Probably I mean, I shouldn't say anybody, I don't mean to be that general, but at some extent, yes, you can. But if you take somebody who is not experienced in the profession or aware of local government, what you're going to be missing out on are stuff that the council isn't even going to know that you're missing out on. If somebody doesn't understand local government finance or public-private partnerships or certificates of participation and how municipalities do economic development versus the private sector. I don't mean to be making it sound like I'm picking on the private sector, but the point is, I couldn't walk in and be the best CEO of some private corporation. Could I keep it afloat? Probably, because I'm a smart guy and I understand leadership and board manager dynamics. But they're going to miss out on something that they may not even know they're missing out on, right? It's the
Right.
I don't know what I don't know kind of thing. What is the direction of our profession? Where does higher ed play into that? Where do all of these complex variables come in to ensure that we maintain the value of the council manager form of government, and through our work in AAME, the value of the professional, and not that any caveman can do it or we're a dime a dozen. And I'm not proposing or stating that I have an answer to that, but I personally have a concern and have been working with the CU grad school at Denver and our Colorado City County Management Association to look at how can we do a better job of connecting the the
The value
profession,
that you bring to the
yeah,
yeah.
and getting the tie-in so that we maintain, and again, not making judgment on higher ed, but if that's at least our historical, how do we maintain the level of interest in people getting into the MPA program, since it is a standard bar at this point, and tying that higher ed with the professionals in whatever fashion we can do to improve it. Because I do have a concern that, over time it can start, if we're not intentional about thinking around this space, it could degrade into a place. And then what is a professional manager?
Right.
And not that there is an answer now, but I could see it getting more complex and disjointed. And then that plays into the hiring and everything we've talked about over the last many hours. It just,
This is something I've been preaching for 2 years now. And I didn't, it wasn't like I 2 years ago I started posting on LinkedIn, and I had this vision or thought or belief system or paradigm that I thought like, oh, this is how the model it should be. But it's just over the course of posting and synthesizing all the data and getting the feedback from all these touch points of dozens and dozens, hundreds of conversations with our peers, is that we don't value ourselves as city managers. And what I mean by that is we're so apt and so quick because we're used to the buck stops with us and taking all the blame and making sure the governing body gets all the credit. Heaven forbid we take credit for something that happens to the city instead of giving it to a department head or staff because we don't want to be, that person or whatever. And so, when you have city attorneys who don't bat an eye when it comes to making $300 an hour, no one questions that at all. You have a law degree, it's like, oh my gosh, it's manna from heaven. You must be the God's greatest gift to humanity because you got a law degree. But yet, when you're a city manager, it's like, oh, there's nothing special about that. It's plug and play model. It's any so easy a caveman can do it. It's a dime a dozen. Well, I believe that we as city managers need to be much more assertive in placing properly valuing ourselves. And the way you properly value ourselves in this country, in this market, this dynamic is by ensuring that we get better compensation and benefits that reflect the risks that we take and reflects the skills that are needed to be successful, the experience and education that is required. And we got to start working on minimizing the turnover. You got to make our services more valuable and more costly to separate in order to reduce that volatility. It's like this, everyone knows that blue bag is Tiffany. It costs a lot of money, right? You know what I mean?
Hmm.
And we're essentially the when it comes to city managers, we're too busy playing in the store brand space. We're the Kirkland water or the Sam's Club whatever, or the Dr. Thunderbolt crap at Walmart or whatever. Like, we need to start marketing ourselves as being valuable non-commodities, that we have expertise, that we bring something to the equation that you can't just get anywhere else. And I'm just sick and tired of watching a bunch of city attorneys get paid 200, $300 an hour for doing half the work that we do and getting no blame, no risk, and no other crap that goes along with the stuff that we have to assume for the job. Why is it that I look around and I see more often than not a school superintendent who doesn't have near the complexity of the job that we have, doesn't have nearly the financial resource strains that we have to deal with, and the different competing dynamics as far as different constituencies and what have you? Why are they getting paid more than us? Why aren't we demanding more? You know what I mean? And so I think we as a profession, we as each professionals have to do a better job of valuing ourselves, because if we don't put a value on ourselves, right, if we don't respect ourselves, why do we expect anybody else to do it?
I don't disagree with what you're saying. I don't. I'm trying to think of, how do we move and shift that paradigm, because I don't think it's just about contractual agreements. I think that's a component of it, but I think it goes to the totality of everything we've been talking about, and really probably on this segment more than anything, because what is a professional manager? And we've got to start, and I don't know if these are the right words, but we've got to start with a place that our elected bodies value the position and understand that.
Well, that's it, Michael. And sorry to interrupt you. I've talked about this in other podcast episodes. We live in this age of Google, right? Where anything that you do can be Googled and you can be an instant expert, right? It's like the constant memes that I see on Twitter or Facebook. It's like, oh, today I'm a Ukrainian, Russian, international relations expert. And then 5 minutes later, I'm an expert on Palestine and Israel
Yeah,
relations. And then 5 minutes later, after, former President Trump is getting shot, I'm an expert on sniper ballistics
yeah,
and you know what I'm
yeah.
saying? It's like everyone's an expert. You know what I mean? I think it's the devaluing of that expertise that's caused a huge issue with our profession.
And so that means, what your statement means to me is that we need to double down on everything that we've just been talking about. What is the standard that we want to set for ourselves to be defined as a professional city manager? And, whether that's an MPA or it ties back into an ICMA credentialing program, what is it that defines it around, so it doesn't degrade into whatever terms you want to use. And to me, again, it goes back to, and continuing to educate the elected body. And then I also appreciate what you just said a few moments ago, that we need to take pride in ourselves and we need to stand up for ourselves. And certainly one way we do that is to have a solid contract so I feel comfortable standing up for myself.
Absolutely.
I don't, I don't know that for me as an individual, it's not about the money in terms of how that gives pride, but it's an assurance, probably more, and I'm just thinking out loud here, probably more through the severance language and how they can let me go that would give me really the confidence to speak up. But really at the end of the day, I think it's going to more than that. It's going to come down to communication and how do I relate to my elected body? Am I having a good conversation and communication with them? Like probably like with most managers, I meet with every one of them once a month. Obviously, the mayor I meet with a lot more, and some I have a good relationship with, some I don't. But you try to meet with every one of them so you understand who they are as a human being, what are they valuing, what are their goals being on the council. But there's something in the totality of everything that we're talking about that still comes back to how do we maintain in the totality of the equation of the council manager form of government, how do we make sure that we have the most educated elected body, whatever that means, and then how do we maintain that level of professional, and how are we working with the variety of managers? And as we've said numerous times, there is no competency test, but how do we have them have that intentional awareness, and I'm trying not to use BS bingo terms. How do we have them be able to look in the mirror and really own who they are, what they need to get improve, and be the best manager they can in the situation that they're in, right? Because it's not a cookie cutter cut and paste. So again, I don't have the answers, but I think there's a role, and maybe this is kind of put a bow on it for you, that AAME can play in all of these spaces in, I'll use the word forcing or hosting the conversations so that we can figure out collectively what do we see as the best path forward in really everything that we've been talking about over the last multiple hours.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. This is the longest interview I've ever had at one time. Even the Daniel Rosemont, even those 3 episodes, it was divided into 2 different sittings. So we are doing one stretch run here, unbelievable. This is my first Joe Rogan-esque podcast. I will not have it be one. It won't just be one episode though. I will actually milk this one for a couple of different episodes.
However you
Man.
want to do it, my friend.
Hey, buddy, I really appreciate you being on. Do you have any final words or comments before we say goodbye?
I would echo what we've said several times. I mean, one, I have great respect for you and what AAME
Thank
is
you.
doing. That is why I joined the organization. I also will continue to be an ICMA member. I'm proud and honored to be the chair of the Credentialing Advisory Program. I think what we're doing is good for the profession and for the council manager form of government. I believe that in my heart. And I look forward to seeing what you and the other 2 executive members take AAME, and as I've said numerous times, I think both organizations can coexist. But you really have a unique opportunity to look at the missing space and the missing conversations, and I think we've hit on a lot of opportunity for AAME to play in. And if ICMA wants to get in some of that space, more power to them. This isn't about ownership or this. I mean, collectively, I think all we all want is to have the best elected body, the best managers, the best organizations that we can have, because we haven't really said it, but I'd close on every one of those council meetings across this nation on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, whatever day they are, is part of what makes democracy and makes this great nation of ours work. And I am, even when I groan going into a council meeting, there is a part of me that we are a small microcosm in Castle Pines of what makes this nation great, and it's
It's
through
a beautiful
quality
thing.
managers. It absolutely is, and it's having elected officials that have respectful debate and dialogue and make the policy decision that they feel is best for their community. And that's not my job, that's theirs. My job's to implement it. And what an honorable profession to be able to create community and a place where people can live, work, play. I know I was trying not to say BS bingo words, but live, work, and play and be proud of where they live because they're putting their hard-earned money into their homes, etc. And what an honor to be part of that. And so I think all of us collectively, we just want to create the best governance model we can. And there's a lot of work to be done. So I'll leave it at that.
Awesome. Yeah, I agree with you. It's a great way to end this episode. Thank you again for being on. We've spent like 5.5 hours together. It's been amazing.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been awesome. And thank you very much for your time. I appreciate your support and the trust you've placed in me and the leadership team by becoming a founding member. It's not lost on me and others who are also ICMA members. Somehow it could be a little bit of a delicate balance or a walk to be in part of both organizations. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome. And I hope for others as they make a decision that they don't feel it's got to be one or the other. There's going to be any negative feelings one way or the other. We all choose, it's membership based, and people should be looking at what services they provide. And as I've said several times with you, I don't see any conflict in being a member of both.
Awesome. I'm Joe Turner. This is the City Manager Unfiltered podcast, a podcast for city managers and other public sector executives. It is the most influential local government podcast in America. If you like our content, if you like the interview I had today with Michael Penny of Castle Pines, Colorado, please hit that like and follow button or hit the rating and review button on Apple. Thank you very much. Have a good day.